The wizard's world.
In King Arthur's time, it was all the rage to go on a quest in search of the Holy Grail. Tossing in their beds o' nights, every one of Arthur's liege knights dreamed of acquiring this prize, which would bring God's protection and blessing to their king. If a cave should be discovered in the limestone hills jutting on the horizon of Camelot, it would be instantly occupied with some knight doing penance in hopes of gaining a vision of the Grail. With all their visions and dreams, people came to see the Grail as an ornate golden goblet inlaid with jewels.
It is nearly impossible to convince mortals that quests are never for outward things, however holy, Merlin told Arthur.
Arthur remembered those words whenever Grail fever reached a pitch in his court, which was usually in the long dark months of December when the knights were bored and restless from want of exercise. The younger ones in particular were forever champing to quest to the Holy Land or to the castle at Montsalvat or any place, mythical or real, where the Grail might be kept.
The king himself kept aloof from the buzzing talk. "If you want to go," he would say, his voice trailing off.
What? Don't you believe in the Grail? A rash knight asked impetuously.
Believe? Arthur replied quietly, "Yes, but not in the way you think."
His answer was troubling. "Is the Grail real, my lord?" Galahad asked. He was a gentler soul, and the king regarded his question with more favor.
"You ask as if you think I've beheld it," Arthur said, but not another word could be coaxed from his lips.
Then one night in earliest spring, just as the fields were thawing and nodding jonquils, no longer than a thumbnail, had burst like gold among the fading Christmas roses, a fire could be seen at a distance outside the walls of Camelot. Around the fire sat Sir Galahad, and with him Sir Percival, who had together pledged to hold a holy retreat. Percival lifted his older head and said to fair Galahad, "I tell you, brother, my soul burns to capture this thing, the Grail." "The king says it isn't a thing," the younger knight reminded him. Percival brushed this aside impatiently. "But he also says Merlin brought the Grail into England. Why, you heard him yourself, didn't you?" Galahad merely nodded and threw some dry hazel brush into the fire. "I don't know if my heart is pure enough to gain the Grail, and I'm not so vain or stupid as to believe it must fall into my hands, but my heart will be sore until I try."
At that moment, the two companions heard the crunch of footsteps lightly breaking through the thin layer of ice still covering the shaded ground nearby. They tensed, waiting for the stranger to identify himself, when a faintly mocking voice said, "Don't be frightened and pray me leave. I need a fire, if you know how to build one."
Percival looked at Galahad, then called into the darkness, "Why, be off and build your own fire. This is a retreat of two knights who must not have exchange with the world's vanity."
A laugh came back in reply, even more stinging than the earlier mockery. "Build my own fire, you say? Then I shall."
Before these words died on the frosty air, Percival jumped to his feet in alarm, because the ground under his breeches had caught fire. Galahad looked around in amazement to see that a flaming circle now surrounded them, springing from the frozen earth itself. Before he could cry out, a tall figure, gaunt as an old fir tree, walked through the fire and stood over them. "Merlin," Galahad whispered, "what brings you here after this long leave?"
"Not your insolent friend here." Merlin was eyeing Percival, who was trying to maintain whatever scrap of dignity a man can possess when his backside is on fire. "Sit down. Sit down."
Percival felt the embarrassing pain go away, and he took his seat, very carefully, next to Galahad, with Merlin opposite them. Neither had ever set gaze upon him before, but Arthur's description had been accurate, right down to the wizard's cruel slippers of worn black moleskin and his long beard, which looked like forked lightning.
"Don't stare. I'm thinking."
Percival asked, "About what?"
"And don't interrupt," was all the wizard had to say in reply. After a moment, his rather hard-set expression softened. "Yes, I believe you are telling the truth. Now the only problem is what to do about it."
Galahad said, "Why, we most earnestly desire to follow this quest, Master Merlin."
"Your king spoke aright, you know. The Grail isn't a thing you can run after on horseback like a fox. It isn't made of gold, and therefore brings no one a material reward. Neither can it be hoarded in secret. And possessing it doesn't confer God's blessing any more than not possessing it.
This was too much for Percival, who was growing more and more agitated. How can you say that? The Grail must confer God's blessing.
Merlin stopped him with a scathing look. My dear clod, if all this world is God's creation, then how could any part of it, however remote or small or unimportant, be any less blessed than any other?
But there is a Grail, isn't there? Asked Galahad hastily. The king told us that you are its protector.
Merlin nodded. Right, lad, I protect what needs no protection. I guide the quest that cannot take you anywhere. And in the end, I will be there when you find the Grail, though you will see neither me nor it.
Percival suddenly stood up. Well, if I am the clod here, let me take my leave. I wouldn't want to lower the conversation.
Merlin's demeanor softened. I meant no offense. You are what you are, which seems to be good enough in God's eyes, and rare enough in this hopeless world. Take your place, if you please. There is a rule that cannot be disobeyed. When the pupil is ready, the master appears. What you wish to know, I can teach you. My opening remarks were not rude or mystical. I only want you to clear your heads of any musty dreams you have about the Grail. Attend to me.
With a curious flick of his hand, Merlin caused the ring of fire to die down around them to a dull glow. And now his craggy features were barely visible by the embers of the campfire. The two knights saw him mostly as a wreath of luminescent white hair lit by the rising moon.
The quest that brings the Grail as its prize is not a journey of the kind ignorant knights crave to mount. It is an inner journey, a quest of transformation. You have both heard tell of this thing called alchemy?
Percival and Galahad nodded, dim figures outlined in the cloaking darkness.
Alchemy is the art of transformation, and when its 7 steps are achieved, then, and only then, will you be able to summon the Grail.
7 steps, Percival asked. Then the Grail is made of gold after all. I know that alchemists turn lead into gold.
Cobwebs and rubbish. You know little or nothing about this art, and yet you have practiced it every day since you were born. Every baby is born an alchemist, then loses the art only to gain it again.
I hope you are intrigued at this point. Merlin has established the rules of the game, as it were. The Grail is real, but not a thing. It is everywhere and nowhere. Therefore you can't go after it. Yet through an inner quest, you can find it. And when you touch the prize, the inner wizard will be there beside you. In one form or another, every spiritual tradition contains this knowledge and poses this riddle. Saints, avatars, and gurus are different guises for Merlin, each playing the wizard's role. Right now we live in a material age, and scientific questing is much easier for us to understand than inner questing. A wizard would say, we have lost our ability to hear the voice of spirit. And yet, since we were all born as innocents without judgment against spirit, we are naturally alchemists. If we could only pick up the thread again, we are the heroes and heroines of our own Grail quest. But first you have to realize that there is a quest. Here's another way to put it, as imparted to the young King Arthur.